Thanks for joining us. Now, right at the very top, I want to thank Michael Della Carpini, Faculty Director of the SNF PIDEA Program, and Chaz Howard, Vice President for Social Equity and Community, for their leadership in imagining this preceptorial and bringing it to life, or virtual life, depending on your perspective. So let's start at the start. What is a preceptorial? Simply, it's a discussion of ideas. It's not a course for credit. There will be no tests or quizzes, I promise, and it's open to the entire Penn community, though the breakout sessions are limited to undergraduates to keep things manageable. Think of it as learning for learning's sake. As a place committed to diversity, community, and the exploration of knowledge and ideas, Penn and Penn faculty are well positioned for this preceptorial and well represented on our panel today. But we have no monopoly on ideas or solutions, which is why we've included experts from outside Penn to join our discussion. Racism and anti-racism in contemporary America, the topic of the preceptorial, and income and wealth disparities, the topic of today's panel, are both timely in a good way and timeless in a not very good way. If the past year has shown us anything, it's that racism and racial inequality, especially when it comes to Black people, but not only, continue to define life in America. Indeed, one can plausibly argue that they are definitional to the very idea of America from its very beginning. The killings and protests of this year have led many observers to wonder, and I include myself here, if the country is at a precipice of a steep decline or at the beginning of a welcome rise to a fairer and more equal future. It's safe to say it feels like a tipping point, one way or another. I'm hopeful and cautiously optimistic that it's the latter. That said, this is our reality. There's no corner of American life unaffected by racism, and our panel discussions over the next several months will focus on many areas: public health and wellness, including COVID, and I'll return to that in a second, the economy, the workplace, education at all levels, and the media. And a quick plug for a panel I'll be on November 19th about fair housing. Since it's all on our minds pretty much all the time, let me return to COVID. Its outsized effect on Black and brown people is simply the latest twist in a long string of evidence of racial disparity, and could be filled under shocking but not surprising. NPR analyzed COVID tracking data and found that in 32 states plus Washington, D.C., African Americans are dying at rates much higher than their proportion of the population. In 21 states, it's substantially higher, more than 50% above what would be expected. In a place where just 6% of consider Wisconsin, a pretty white state. In a place where just 6% of the population is Black, more than 240 Black Americans have died, representing 17% of all deaths. What about Pennsylvania? Blacks make up about 10% of the population and account for 30% of the cases and 20% of the deaths. And of course, these cases are rising, unfortunately. COVID's impact are the impacts of racism in miniature: health disparities, quality of care differences, vast gaps in wealth, and economic inequality. In short, structural racism across all areas of American society. Structural racism, its consequences and its solutions are the connective tissue of our preceptorial. Today's discussion will focus on the economic system, and in closing, I'm going to welcome and introduce our panelists. But let me just set the stage with a data point. This is from a recent story in the Washington Post. In 1968, adjusted for inflation, a typical middle-class white household had about $70,000 in wealth. The typical middle-class Black household had $6,600, $70,000 to $6,600. In 2016, the typical middle-class Black household had $13,000 in wealth. The white household had $150,000. The gap is now larger in percentage terms. Put another way, you have to combine the net worth of nearly 12 Black households to get the net worth of one white household. And this gap crosses all segments of society, even in Black households headed by those who are highly educated. Again, shocking, but not surprising. I'm sure our panelists will discuss this and other disparities and the ways that they can and hopefully will be addressed in the coming years. So our panelists today include Amy Castro Baker, Assistant Professor of Social Policy and Practice at Penn, Darrick Hamilton, Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy at the New School, Lisa Servon, Kevin and Erica Penn Presidential Professor of City and Regional Planning, and Regina Baker, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Penn. Michael Della Carpini will moderate. So thanks again for joining our discussion. Michael?
I want to thank you, Wendell, for your introductions and for your support for this initiative. I'd like to add my thanks to today's panelists as well, and to our audience. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors of this panel and the larger set of panels that we'll be doing, which includes the SNF Padilla program, which I am the faculty director of, the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, thanks again, Wendell, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives. As Wendell said, this is the first of 13 panel discussions running through the end of May, focusing on the way in which race and racism is embedded in our country's economic, housing, health, criminal justice, cultural, media, and political systems. Now, you could spend an entire semester or longer on any one of those topics. So we see it as a kind of primer on the ways in which racism is manifested within these systems, the causes of this fact, and the consequences of it, and ideally be able to talk a little bit about effective or at least possible remedies for this 400-year-old difference in American society. I also should add that while the focus for some obvious timely reasons is on racism as it affects African Americans and whites, we're very aware that other groups, other minority groups and group identity groups and cultural groups also face discrimination, and that discrimination and racism is not limited to the United States. So while we are focusing on that, we hope to do other preceptorials in the future that expand on this notion. So this is going to be a pretty open conversation followed by Q&A from the audience. And so those of you who are listening in and watching, you should have a Q&A function on your Zoom images in front of you. You can post any questions throughout the course of the discussion. They will only be seen by me and the panelists, and we won't be able to answer all of them, but I'll curate them and ask at least a few of them towards the end of our session. So feel free, please do post questions. Now, this first panel, as Wendell said, focuses on income and wealth disparities. And the reason why we decided to start with this particular topic is because, especially in an economic system like the United States, income and wealth are arguably at the center or foundation of many of the other race disparities that we'll be talking about over the course of the academic year. Now, I said arguably because there are other sources of racism and structural racism, but that's the premise that we're starting with. So without any additional introductory comments, let's begin, panelists, by giving the audience a sense of the extent of racial differences in income and wealth, which Wendell started us with, if and how this has changed over time, what it means for the day-to-day lives of people living at the economic margins. And while I'll be asking all the panelists to jump in on this first question, let's start with Professor Hamilton. Darrick, would you start us off? What's the extent of racial disparity in wealth and income in the United States? What does it look like?
Well, let me start with gratitude. Gratitude to you, Provost Pritchett, my fellow colleagues, and I certainly want to shout out my former dean, Lisa Servon, who's on the panel, whom presided when I got tenure. So thank you, Lisa. So let me start with that. Income and wealth disparity are dramatic, particularly wealth disparity. If we look regardless of race, we can say that in the United States, the top 0.1% of earners, those making above 1.5 million prior to the pandemic, controlled about 90% of the nation's wealth. If we look at the bottom 50%, they control about 1% of the nation's wealth. This concentration is larger than it's ever been, dating at least back to the Great Depression, to a generation that was coming out of the Gilded Age. The problem with this is not only the economic concentration of resources, but the plutocracy, the ability to convert those economic resources into political gain, to structure rules in favor so that you can continue to accumulate. It's anti-democratic. But however unequal we are in terms of class, it's even more pronounced when we look at race. Black people make up about 13% of the United States population, but own less than 3% of the nation's resources. If we look at the wealth disparity at the median, the typical Black and white household, as Provost Pritchett pointed out, the typical Black household has about a dime for every dollar in wealth as the typical white household. But what's really important about wealth is it not as an outcome, but the agency it affords for you, the economic security and financial agency to make decisions in your life. We often think of it as an outcome, but the ability for wealth to provide you to go to Penn, to provide you to fight an expensive legal system if you're confronted with legal challenges, medical challenges. If you want to have agency in your life beyond just being a worker, you need some assets in order to do so. And in the United States context, it's often in private assets. So let me point out a couple more things, then I'm going to stop. Thinking about millennials. So millennials today have lower home ownership rates than similarly aged generations dating as far back as the Great Depression, as the greatest generation, whom again were coming into their young adulthood right during the Great Depression. And what's more, and we think, why pay attention to home ownership? Because in the US context, it is the asset by which most Americans store their wealth and passively appreciate wealth beyond those at the top, the extreme. Moreover, for millennials, the racial disparity in home ownership amongst millennials is larger than every other generation since we've been systematically capturing it. So for Black millennials, they're generationally low, and they're even further scarred because they're racially low. And we told this generation to go to college to wait out the last Great Recession during that economic scarring, and they came out with record levels of student debt. And now they're faced with this pandemic where they're going to face additional scarring without government intervention to act. So our reality is that the wealth disparity is dramatic. It will get worse, and that is unless government acts. And if we think about this pandemic in race, similar to Provost Pritchett's comments, we know that Black businesses have 45% of them have already succumbed to the pandemic, nearly half. And if we look at mortality, with 220,000 deaths and climbing, knowing that Blacks make up 13% of the population and have twice the rate of mortality than the white population. So however pervasive and presumably random a pandemic may be, it is immoral that we have a country where a political economy exists that Black people are twice as likely to die from the pandemic than whites. So that would suggest that there have already been in excess of 50,000 Black deaths. And if Blacks were treated in this political economy similar to whites, we would have an excess or less a surplus of more than 25,000 deaths. So to translate that, we would have 25,000 fewer Black deaths if Black people were treated the same as white people in our political economy.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you're painting a picture that I think people need to see. Regina, I know you've done work in this area. What would you like to add to what Darrick just said? What other aspects of income and wealth inequality would you like to highlight?
Yeah, thank you. So my research focuses primarily on poverty. And so I want to speak from my perspective on that in regard to this racial disparities in the US. So it's not surprising, given the income gaps and the wide wealth disparities that were just outlined, that when it comes to poverty, Blacks are at the bottom, or at the bottom in terms of most likely to be poor. And when we look at annual census reports like this year, the White House likes to tout, oh, there's been a decline in poverty. There are less Blacks poor now than there were in the previous year. But I also want to point out a couple of things. One is our poverty measure that the US uses is very problematic in terms of what they're capturing. And it's not truly capturing the extent of economic hardship in America. When it comes to our poverty measure, it doesn't take into account so many things that are important for us to understand the extent of poverty in the US. And I think that it's important when we think about these racial disparities, or what am I trying to put it, or reports that things have gotten better, that's not quite the case. So, for example, poverty rates have declined over time, but what's important here is that Blacks still have significantly higher poverty rates. So there's still a large gap over time. And the percentage points, according to official poverty measures, like two percentage points, which first isn't much. But when we take into account the fact that there are many Black Americans who are officially not poor based on the official poverty measure, but are suffering from inability to not meet their material needs. So material hardship is important to think about here, right? So there are many families who don't qualify to be poor based on the official poverty threshold, but there are many families who aren't poor, but yet can't afford, to pay rent, can't afford to pay medical bills, are suffering from food insecurity. And so these are families that are not even captured in the poverty measure that we have. And so all that to say, things are even worse than what's laid out when we get these government statistics. So it's bad enough that Blacks are worse off, but in reality, they're even more worse off than things appear. And so I wanted to point that out, which is important as well. And when we think about the pandemic, there's already been projections in terms of thinking about what's going to happen in the long term in terms of poverty rates. And we've already seen now there are so many more Americans who are in poverty now as a result of the pandemic, and most likely to be African American. And that actually is going to increase even more projectedly over time. So out of Columbia, they did these projections and said, based on the unemployment rate, which is extremely high and highest among Black Americans, if we continue along these trends with the pandemic and the economy the way it is, those rates are going to be even higher and disproportionately affecting Black Americans. And so I think it's important when we talk about disparities to also think about these things as well.
Thank you for that, those additions. Amy, do you want to add some of your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the kind of components of the racial wealth gap, Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Baker covered pretty well. The thing I just want to highlight really quickly is to think that sort of we can get lost in these numbers, right? And this is part of the problem, is that it's so big that we forget that these are real people in real families, in real lives, and they're the folks that are holding up our economy. And so, in particular, a lot of the work that I focus on is on single Black women. And reason being is that it's not just about that data point. It's not just about the house that's lost or the wealth gap, right? It's about all the people that are relying on her to make ends meet, right? And so if we think about the average person who lost wealth during the Great Recession, there's a lot of data I could give about this. I won't, bore students with it, because they can look it up later on Canvas. But it's not just about that individual person. It's also about these cohorts of women who are caring for aging parents, right, who are at great risk for, COVID, right? And they're also caring for the next generation. And so it's not just about these individual people who are losing wealth. It's also about the ways in which we have sort of made Black families be the backstop of a failing safety net. So we intentionally designed the safety net in such a way that it doesn't actually help people accumulate wealth or or assist when they're there. And then we push that gap, in resources back onto the family and expect them to hold it up. So there's a lot I could say about that, and I'll hold back for right now. But I just want to kind of push people to think beyond the numbers, and that these are individual folks, and they're living at the nexus of policy system failures that are intentional. And they don't have to be that way. These are policy choices, right? So it's not just like there's a givenness, like this is how things have to be. These are intentional policy choices that we made in prior eras that got us to this particular point. I'll close in this part with just saying, 2 quick stats. When we look at early baby boom women who I specifically study, women of color between the ages of 45 and 65, they ended the recession with a dramatic loss in wealth. And this is before the pandemic even hit. So if you look at the net worth of women in that group, again, who are those who are caring for aging parents while also caring for the next generation coming up, the millennials that Dr. Hamilton was speaking about, Black women's wealth in that group dropped by 74%. So what that means is that they're sort of coming of age where they should be hitting retirement, but they're not eligible yet for safety net benefits. And yet they are serving, again, as that backstop for a failing economy and a failing safety net that's not set up to meet their needs.
Thanks. I think thanks. I mean, those are depressing statistics, but I also appreciate you humanizing this. And Lisa, I know you've done some work, some ethnographic work, as well as knowing the larger statistics. Add your sense of what this means, this gap in income and wealth.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And it's great to be here with everyone. I thought I would maybe just invoke or talk about a little bit 2 systems that maybe many of us on the call take for granted, that we use every day and that affect the life chances, the ability to be citizens, the economic chances of people differently. And those are the banking system and the justice system. I've done a lot of work on financialization and specifically why people use the financial services that they do. Black people in particular use alternative financial services like check cashers and payday lenders and pawn shops in greater numbers proportionate to their population than white people do. And the sort of received wisdom of that at a very high level is, gee, there's something wrong. They must be ignorant if they don't understand that they should be using a bank. And in fact, banks don't treat Black people very well. There is a lot of institutionalized racism. There's sort of a banking while Black catchphrase. We've seen a lot, if you just in the public media, stories about people being arrested for fraud because they had a good check to cash, people being profiled. And in fact, so when you look at why people are using the systems that they do, there are often really good reasons for that, that go beyond just the fact that one seems to cost a lot of money and the other doesn't. And people are not necessarily treated well by mainstream financial institutions. So while you and I grew up going to a bank with my dad on Saturdays and depositing his paycheck, and we were treated well in that small town bank, but that's not the experience of many people living in Black and brown communities. That simple act of banking or managing your money has gotten to be really important in the last couple of decades because your credit scores didn't even exist for all of you undergraduates in the 1980s. And now it's this number, this credential, this financial credential that represents financial citizenship that you need in order to apply for a job and to rent an apartment or to buy a house. Credit scores do not take into account things like whether you pay your rent or not. They do take into account if you pay your mortgage, wealth right there, right? And so these decisions that people are making about how to manage their money become really important in terms of whether folks can participate equally in society and in the economy. The other institution I just want to mention really quickly is the justice system, and to recognize how that too has been incredibly financialized. So, if I run a red light and I get a ticket, it's probably going to be a couple $100. I can probably pay that. I have a good job at Penn. pays me enough to pay running a red light ticket. But if I didn't have that money, first of all, $200 is a lot of money if you're living paycheck to paycheck. And secondly, if I don't pay that, I'm going to pay interest. I'm going to pay other surcharges on top of that could make it go up to about $2,000. I may have to pay court fees. And if I don't pay it in enough time, I might actually have to go to jail. And so when we look at the larger criminal justice system, which also has been financialized in many ways, and invoking the work that Amy just talked about, for people who are incarcerated, who are paying all kinds of money to be in prison or to be in jail, it's women who are paying, and Black women who are paying the majority of those fees. So these systems don't, again, just impoverish families, they impoverish, or individuals, they impoverish families and communities as well.
Those are great points, and you've really begun to touch on a number of the things we hope to talk about next. But let me just put two other statistics. We talked a lot about wealth. I think wealth is the right place to focus because it's a much better indicator, even with poor measurement, as Regina said, of people's ability to cope with day-to-day life and problems. But it's not just wealth, right? It's the average Black family's median household income is just over $41,000, whereas for white families, it's $70,000, close to twice. And it's unemployment. Black unemployment rate is just consistently about twice. They go up and down with the larger economy, but it tends to be consistently twice that of white. So this really carries over into the economic system in a variety of different ways. So we now have given, I hope, the audience a picture of the income and wealth gap, just a brief picture, both statistically and personally. So what do we know about the root causes of this disparity? More specifically, is it driven by explicit racism, or are we at a point where no one needs to hold? I hear this many times in the surveys that I work on, and also in people that I know, that I'm not racist. I'm not an individual who holds racist attitudes. We can talk about how true that is, given what we know about implicit racism. But are we at a point where no one needs to hold racial animus anymore because it's so embedded structurally? And why don't I start with you, Lisa, and we'll work our way back again. So what do we know about why this long-standing difference as it relates to race exists in our economic system? Have there been periods where it's been less? How explicit or implicit is it?
I think, I was tempted when you asked that question just to say yes. It's it's racism, it's structural racism. That's the reason behind it all. And all of us, Black, white, brown, are embedded in this. In some ways, I think that it's sort of beside the point to try to pin the label of racist on someone else or to claim that you're not racist. That's not really the conversation. The important conversation, I think, is to understand the way in which the systems that we're all embedded in, whether it's the education system, the healthcare system, the banking system, the justice system, are all have this structural racism at their core. There are different outcomes. People are treated differently based on their race. And so if you care about that, then the question is, how can I be anti-racist? Even though I probably hold these biases that all of us do, how can I be anti-racist? What can I do to change the way that systems work? How can I and the institutions in which I belong dismantle these structures and these systems? In terms of, Michael, your question about what specifically has done that, I think I'll say for a second about the criminal justice system. We see this enormous increase in imprisonment, incarceration, starting in the late 70s and early 80s with the war on drugs. It's not actually that so many more people started using drugs, and so many more Black people started using drugs. It was the way in which the laws were created and carried out. Similarly, with other systems around wealth and income, well, we see lots of discrimination in the job market, and Darrick can even talk about that with respect to not just Black and white, but skin shade disparities. But in terms of wealth, Amy should probably say more about this, about homeownership, right? And the story of how it became a lot easier for white people to own homes and accumulate wealth, as the home is probably the vehicle by which most people obtain and grow their wealth. Lots and lots of policy that was very explicit, not just an accident of white people choosing not to live near Black people, but explicit policies that kept Black people from owning homes and moving into particular neighborhoods. I'm really curious about what everyone else is going to say, so I'm gonna stop there, even though there's so much to talk about.
Oh, that's great. That's a great start. And since you invoked Amy, do you want to give us your thoughts on root causes?
Sure. I have many. As my students know, I could go on about it forever. It's the first thing I would say is something that I say to my policy students a lot. Is I often say to them, you can't opt out of your era, right? So if we start with the premise that our country is indeed structurally unjust and predicated on structural racism, that means that I cannot opt out of it. Right? Like I have to first see it. And so what I mean when I say opt out is I can't somehow believe that I have kind of educated myself out of participating in a racist system, right? Like we are beholden to it. We are a part of it, right? And this is, I think, oftentimes the first hurdle, depending on what your career path is or where you're headed, at sort of recognizing a system for what it is. Is that it's a lot easier for me to point my finger at my neighbor and to say, well, they're a lot more racist than me. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do X. I wouldn't do Y. I wouldn't do Z, right? But when we do that, what we're doing is we're blinding ourselves to the very systems that we're benefiting from, because we're so focused on this micro level piece because we want to worry about labels rather than seeing the system as a whole. So that oftentimes can blind us to these ideas of accumulated disadvantage, and it becomes almost an arms race of awareness. I mean, with my students, it's like this oftentimes, where it's who can find the next group that's been targeted, rather than saying, like, this is a structure that is accumulating disadvantage, injustice, and racism, and reproducing it on its own, whether I act or I don't act. And until we sort of see that piece first, we can't really understand root causes. But to piggyback on, Lisa's question on housing, when I think specifically about the groups that I study most closely, which is Black women in home ownership, what we see specifically that frightens me is that we're reversing, decades of community organizing. So if we think about that cohort of women that I talked about at the very beginning, women between the ages of 45 and 65, they were the first cohort of women to have access to credit in their own name. After the Fair Housing Act, after the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which expanded credit to women, they were the first group of women of color, to get access to credit. So when we talk about these reversals in wealth that are happening post-recession and going into COVID, we're talking about reversing decades of community organizing and coalition building that took place in the 60s and 70s. And why that happened is because we intentionally designed our housing markets to exclude some and include others. So, Black families were locked out of all the New Deal era homeownership policies. So they literally were not able to accumulate wealth, which, there's lots of stuff you can read about that in terms of redlining. But what happened then going into the housing crisis is that those very communities that were locked out from wealth accumulation were targeted by predatory lenders in the run-up to the housing crisis. Specifically, elderly Black women in particular were targeted by predatory lenders to pull the wealth out of their homes. So that dynamic really disrupted, the stability that families had sort of built against all odds. So that's, when I think about root causes, it's both in me, in terms of the systems that I participate in, and it's also our policy structures and the way that they're set up. And I know we're going to talk about remediating this, at the latter part of the discussion, but sitting with that first and owning the fact that being at Penn means that you have a position of privilege and you are in some way benefiting from a system has to be the first step. Like if you can't see it in yourself, you can't begin to disentangle it in terms of data.
That's an extremely important point, and to put a little bit of an optimistic spin, the moment that we're in now, as I mentioned earlier, I do public opinion research, and it does appear that there's an awakening going on to some of the issues that you just mentioned among people who were likely to deny that this is structural and that it is in all of us. So thank you for making those points.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Marketplace just used the phrase structural racism the other day. I almost took my car off the road.
Yeah.
Right? We are definitely at a moment of public conversation. It's a good time to have this conversation.
Regina, what would you like to add to this part of the conversation?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is important when we think about causes of racial inequality and the different trends that we're seeing is to take a step back and think about just like the basic, right? And so in the US, we have these racial categories, and it's important to not lose sight of the fact that the creation of these racial categories required racism, right? This ideology or belief that human groups can be hierarchically structured. And so those racialized groups, the boundaries between them, have been further hardened and institutionalized by imputing meaning to them. So think about, free versus, enslaved people, human versus savage, right? So otherwise it would be these meaningless categories. And so by establishing these groups, these racialized groups, this racialized system was created, right? And that, as me and my brilliant colleague, Darrick Williams, in this paper that we're working on that underscores this point, that we point out is that by having these racial categories, it essentially gave legitimacy to this white racial identity as a privileged position. And we see that through the ways that the laws that put out policies, social practices, everyday discourse, right? And so it's important to not lose sight of the fact that these historical processes are important, right? These things that made race possible are therefore contributing to racial inequality. And so that's an important thing to just remember, right? And so people can say, oh, I don't see race, or I'm beyond race now, or I myself, I don't contribute to this. But the fact is, many people still benefit from this privilege as a result of just how we think about race and how people are categorized, just by nature of how that is set up. And I think that's just one important part when we think about these causes that's important to underscore. But in terms of causes, oh man, like you said, we could have a whole class on this, and there's so much to cover here. But one part I want to strictly focus on is the importance of place and historical context for understanding these trends that we see in these disparities, because we know that individuals are located, right, in a geographical space, right, or context, and those places themselves can be molded or mold stratifications, right? Whites tend to live in fundamentally different spaces than racial ethnic minorities, particularly Blacks, for example, and as a result, they experience different, like whites, for example, experience different and better socioeconomic outcomes. We think about things such as Blacks more likely to live in racially segregated communities and places that are characterized by lower levels of education, less wealth, fewer opportunities for economic advancement, right? All this is important to think about. And when we think about the areas in the US where minorities are the most economically distressed, these extremely distressed communities, one common theme of these communities is that there's this history of oppressive institutions there, right? So a lot of my work, I focus on the US South, for example, and thinking about the history of slavery, thinking about Jim Crow, and there's some work that I'm doing now where basically I have this measure of what I call historical racial regimes, what takes into account slavery as well as Jim Crow, thinking about disfranchisement, thinking about segregation, for example, and finding that states that have that score higher on this measure of historical racial regimes more likely to have higher black-white poverty gaps, and finding also that historical racial regimes help explain a significant portion of the black-white poverty gap, right? So the importance of historical context in and of itself is important as well. And also going along with this idea of the importance of place, we also know that places or people in places share different ideologies, there are different public policies that are connected to a particular place, and all of this can impact economic outcomes, and outcomes that we see when we look at these disparities between Blacks and whites, for example. There's research that shows that the higher proportions of Blacks that are in an area is strongly associated with more negative views of Blacks among whites, less public support of welfare, for example. There was a recent study by Zachary Parolin out of Columbia that finds that states with larger percentages of Black residents deprioritize the provision of cash assistance and instead allocate funds more toward encouraging marriage or marriage promotion programs instead, right? So all this is important to think about when we think about these disparities. I think it's like place, context, history, all that has important implications as well.
That's great. Thank you for bringing the points that you just brought in, especially the issue of space. I know you've written about that, and that's really important to keep in mind. Darrick, do you want to take us home on this question?
Sure. So let me start with what it is not. It is not behavioral. It is not attitudinal. The empirical evidence is overwhelming. If we control for income, if anything, Black people save more than white people, as one example. If we look at resources in general, we know that Black people with similar resource parents are more likely to acquire greater years of schooling than white counterparts. We know that Black students are overrepresented in graduate school, and this is probably a resume building strategy in anticipation of labor market discrimination that one might face later in life. We also know that Black people 4 years after graduation have about $50,000 in student debt. So when we think about causality, it is more likely that resources are leading to outcomes than some behavioral deficit or some attitudinal deficit by which we interpret. So, Lisa gave the reference of using alternative financial services. That's not it. That's an outcome because Black people are economically and politically vulnerable. On the one hand, they don't have resources but to choose alternative financial services. It's not ignorance. And then also, banks are able to target them because they're politically marginalized. So when we see fines and fees, it's because a locality can exert influence politically on a population to balance their budgets because they're vulnerable. In general, when we think about our political economy, it is well understood that economic consolidation is iteratively related to political consolidation. It is, I'm sure I'm not telling somebody anything that they don't already know when I say that those with a lot of economic power can also convert that into political power. The part of the equation that we need to understand is that race is not an issue, but a pillar in that relationship. It is the use of labeling Blacks as a surplus population. It is the ability to caricature them as welfare queens, deadbeat dads, and super predators that allows us to define the poor as undeserving, and it impacts our political economy more broadly. So a question might be, well, why would a dominant white population go along with such a political economy where we're able to, have the excess concentration that I began off with at the top, and then still have a political policy response where we're still debating whether to have the third iteration of a CARES Act, and all these Americans are facing eviction, loss of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Well, here's what I believe. It is the trade-off as we become more vertically unequal, it is the offering of horizontal positioning. It is the offering to a general white population, at least you're not Mexican and we're going to build a wall to protect you. At least you're not Black, so you're not the first fired or the last hired. It is that relative status that becomes the mechanism while we're able to have a political economy. So, Michael, you mentioned that there's some elements of change that might be in the air right now. Indeed, we had a protest over the summer with all 50 states and an international movement clamoring that Black Lives Matter. To me, that is able to take place because we're able to redefine value, not in the strict self-interested economic terms of accumulation with no bounds, but to rather include issues of morality, issues of sustainability, and issues of human dignity and how we define value in our political economy. To me, that's the game changer. Once we're able to get a movement where we're promoting shared prosperity and those humanistic values, then the material gains of whiteness, they're immoral. We would be wrong to not recognize the profitability of it, but they become less salient.
That's both your last 2 points are really, really important and related to each other. I'll add to your list of it's not behavior that if you control for income and education, Blacks actually participate in elections than do whites. They're deeply engaged in the system, but it's a resource issue, as you've said several times, and I think that's clearly true. Before we move on to
just one quick point.
Please. Because,
you know, the panelists have correctly mentioned some of the intersectional drains on Black women, but we should also point out all those Black men that are disenfranchised as a result of being incarcerated when we think about civic engagement and political participation.
And to go to root causes, the fact that that the government of Florida, after the public voted to allow them to vote, passed a law that made it impossible that ties to income and wealth, which is, can you pay off the fines and debts that you have or you cannot be a citizen? I think it was Lisa who talked about economic citizenship, and that's very much on display. Before we move on to the last easy question, how do we solve this? I would like to, have there been moments, I mean, I've become more educated as a white person in this current period. I knew a little bit about, but now know a lot more about the 100th anniversary we're approaching of the 1921 Tulsa massacre. But to me, it's not only a systematic pattern that has existed in our history, but there have actually even been moments when wealth that has been accumulated has been explicitly taken away from African Americans. And I don't know if anyone, we don't have a historian on the panel, but does anyone have anything they might add on those more dramatic examples of wealth, not only not being accumulated by African Americans, but literally being taken away from them? Harlem is an example of it in a different kind of way. But there are communities across the country where even the gains that have been made have been lost at various periods. And I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that, if it's an area that you know enough about.
I mean, I'll real quick, and then I'm going to be quiet. Say Tulsa riots. We're about to have the anniversary of the Tulsa riots next year. That'll be the 100th anniversary. So even, and here's the point about, you know, we talk a lot about economics and the fact that wealth begets more wealth, but it is political codification or lack of political codification that also leaves Blacks vulnerable. That even when Black people are able to accumulate resources, they are vulnerable from lack of government protection, from outright terror, exploitation, extrapolation. The last foreclosure crisis, banks were intentional in offering them products that were below prime products, and their race offered that lack of political protection that made them vulnerable.
Thank you for that.
I wanted to just piggyback on that for a second and say what Darrick said refers to what Amy talked about in terms of the extraction of wealth that happened during the financial crisis from Black homeowners, certainly Black women, but the Latinx community too, the Black community lost much more wealth during that crisis. And I would argue that the whole financialization of the criminal justice system is an exercise in wealth extraction from poor Black communities currently. So these are not necessarily single events, but they are opportunistic and very much designed to extract wealth.
Yeah, excellent point.
And talent.
Excellent point. Yeah. In the time we have, I'm sorry, someone else like to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say real quickly, I mean, just to, add to what Lisa and Darrick are saying is that the thing I want people to capture is to understand that the ways in which Black communities were targeted for wealth extraction during the housing crisis was legal. Every single thing, for the most part, that those brokers and predatory lenders, I'm using the language of predatory based on the work that, that my stuff sits on, that was legal. It was legal but unethical. And that's the thing that's so hard for people to grasp, is that the system itself is set up in an unjust way. So when you have a broker saying that my ideal customer is an uneducated widow who's behind on her credit card payments and who has a car payment in addition to a house payment, is having difficulty paying things off, that's in a direct quote to Congress by a broker. When they're saying that that's their ideal customer, they're not hiding it. Right? Like, they're not hiding it because it's legal. And so when we do these things without impunity, we sometimes forget, like we picture, we meaning sort of those of us who care about this from a justice perspective, is that we picture kind of this secret group of people in the corner doing something unsavory that is somehow illegal, when in reality it's the very structure of the system itself that is set up to extract wealth out of Black and brown communities.
Yeah, I mean, and there are so many examples of the point you're making, Amy. I mean, if you look at the way, the very even rational and logical way that placement of hazardous waste facilities are decided, where you try to make it cost effective. What does that mean? You wind up doing it in neighborhoods where the cost of the property is less, where the people have less power to be able to say something about it. So these are great examples of the kind of structural racism. That term sometimes is so general as to not have meaning, but I think these are great examples of exactly what that is about. So, as I said, now for the easy part, what do we do about all this? And I'd like to start with Regina on this, but we'll go across to everyone, and either and or some policy, small as it might be, that seems to be working or has a potential to work, or big picture, kind of blue slate. What would be a more radical approach, a more dramatic approach to dealing with these issues, given how fundamental they are? So, Regina, get us started on this, please.
All right. So when it comes to tackling the issue, I want to make a few points. And one thing I think is first and foremost that's important when it comes to how to address these racial disparities and coming from like how to address from policy standpoint. I think one thing that's important and that's absolutely necessary is an absolute, the word, I don't want to say overhaul, but like this longstanding narrative that it's all about individual choices and behavior. If that's the perspective that you have coming to the policy table, then the likelihood that policies are going to be effective in actually addressing the problem it's not going to happen, right? And so I think it's important when we, approach this issue, and when policymakers approach this issue, right, we have to think about it in terms of, start asking the question, instead of asking, what accounts for these gaps, I think it's more important to ask the question of what's maintaining these gaps, right? And so in thinking about these structural issues and how to approach them, and that these issues are systemic, and it's not always, it's not about just individual behaviors and whatnot, because I have so much research to push back on that. But in terms of just some more practical application in terms of what can we do? Well, one thing that several studies have found, and I know Amy will talk about it some more, is that what helps families? Well, money helps families, right? In terms of thinking about, particularly like low-income families and helping them, just get through the day-to-day, and just given, these high amounts of like food insecurity and overall material hardship, right? People need money in order to get by, not just to get by, but to actually be financially stable, right? And so that's important. That's definitely an important point to underscore there. And that there's studies that show that when families get money, there's this rhetoric, sort of rhetoric that, oh, they're just going to like waste money or blow it or whatnot. But the reality is, there's so many studies that show these families actually use this money to their advantage, right? Use it to pay off big bills, right? Use it to try to minimize their debt. Use it toward, their children and their education, right? And so things such as, these income supports or basic income, thinking about that kind of policy are great. And then thinking about like on the extreme level, when I think about the work that I do that looks at historical context and finding that when we look at contemporary poverty disparities between Blacks and whites, for example, in the US South, and finding that, things such as slavery and things that happened during the Jim Crow era are still salient for understanding today's modern, these inequalities that we see and these persistent inequalities. Then there becomes this question of, okay, well, how do we even address this long-term deficit, right? That the idea that these families were never on families, Black and white, were never on an even playing field, just given this historical context and importance of that for understanding these things. So then the discussion surrounding reparations, right, and just like otherwise, like how can we even come back from before? So that's definitely something I think that should be seriously considered as well as into the policy discussion, right? Just because we can't divert ourselves from historical context. And I see comments all the time that like, oh, this was so long ago. I'm like, it really wasn't that long ago. And my grandmother, she passed away a couple of years ago. She was in her 90s, but she could tell me stories vividly, of, walking to school, and even though her school was further away, they didn't have the bus, the white bus would pass by and people would throw rocks at them. And it wasn't that long ago, right? And I think about, the children of those people on the bus, right? And, and those children, their children, and they're still alive. You pass down people, you pass down, perspectives and things like that. And it's crazy to say that it's all beyond this now, and the historical context in terms of understanding the racism and the racial disparities in America don't matter now. That's something that we definitely have to address in contemporary America.
That's a great point that you're making. I have a former colleague who unfortunately passed away much too young, who was developing experiments in which he had people play the game of Monopoly, where they played it for I think I'll get some of this a little bit off, but basically for 400 minutes, where the rules were biased against one player in systematic ways that reflect elements of racism. And then they get to play for 15 minutes after that, but all the property and wealth that's been accumulated by the person who had the advantages of the rules still has that. And lo and behold, even when they get to play equally, the person who didn't have much never gets to catch up. And so it's a great example of trying to teach people how structural racism works, and how something that seems like it was a long time ago is not really, it still has long fingers into the world that we live in right now. Amy, I know that you've done some work and have talked about the issue of guaranteed income. What are your thoughts on potential solutions to some of the problems we've been raising in this?
Oh yeah, so many. I'll say sort of three real quickly. I think first is sort of centering people in the policymaking process. So the tendency for those of us that are social scientists or economists is that we're like really good at solving complicated problems, and we forget that people are the experts on their own lives. And so some of the best policy initiatives that I have seen have been the ones that include the people who are being locked out of the economy in that process, right? And so presuming first that there is an inherent dignity, value, and worth, and also expertise in the very neighborhoods and communities that most people are trying to work with. And so starting there and saying to people, what do you need? I think this is really what Lisa's work speaks to, is that there's extremely rational, strategic, savvy in communities that often goes underappreciated and undervalued in the policymaking process. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second would be, thinking about different types of data. So, we often think about data in air quotes as being, raw empirical statistics, right? Now that helps me tell a certain type of story as a scientist to scientist, or policymaker to policymaker, but that is not going to change the public's mind. And it's not going to change politicians' mind, right? So, as scientists, we tell terrible stories. If we told better stories, everyone would be wearing a mask and COVID would be, spreading far, far less than it is right now, right? And so when we think about this from, a policy research perspective, is saying, how do I generate narrative data that places people at the center of the policymaking process, while at the same time generating traditional social science and economic research that pushes on both of those things at the same time? So until you kind of start that discourse right there, you can only go so far in what you're able to do. And so I think regardless of what your policy solution is, you have to center people. You have to center, the fact that we believe that they're experts, number two. And then number three, you have to center narrative, because at the core of all this is anti-Blackness. And so if you're not first forced to contend with the fact that we're talking about living people, the numbers almost become moot. And then, of course, specifically, on, solutions, I think there's many. I mean, right now, my work is really focused on basic income. I'm just launched a center last week here at Penn, Center for Guaranteed Income Research, and I'm in the middle of piloting a guaranteed income study in Stockton, California, where we're giving people money, no strings attached. And basic income, I think, has a lot of promise. It can certainly smooth economic volatility. It can certainly, lift people above the poverty line. But guaranteed income only works insofar as it's working in conjunction with other policies that protect wealth, that provide access to jobs, and that provide access to safe banking. And so the way that I tend to think about it is like, yes, basic income, UBI provides a phenomenal step forward in terms of addressing injustice when it comes to, inequity in the market, inequity in wealth, and equity in income. But it has to work in conjunction with other structural policies designed to close the wealth gap. And so that's sort of, I know, a very high level way of putting it, but it's also so simple. I mean, one quick thing I'll throw out just about the data and Stockton, if anyone's interested, is that, one of the critiques we get on that particular project is, what can $500 a month do? Right, in a state like California, where it's so expensive, right? And when you look at the median income of our sample, that introduction of $500 a month for many families amounted to a 30% increase in their household income. And what families are able to do when they're pooling those resources across an entire family network is remarkable. And if anyone wants to see it, you can see our spending data. It's very public, sort of how people are using the money. That's just one, quick example. But thinking about the power of cash in the context of other policies that guarantee a right to work, that guarantee a right to safe access to banking, and what that can be is really reimagining the social contract and reimagining the way that we want to think about our policy systems. And I'm sure that Darrick has a lot more that he can add to that. But I specifically am thinking about basic income at the moment.
That's great. And for the audience, we don't have enough time to talk about it more, but you should really read about the Stockton experiment. It's just completely fascinating, and it's a real world experiment to see how some basic guaranteed income, what its effects are on real people's lives. And also, thank you, Amy, for your point about narrative. You actually answered one of the questions from the audience with that answer. So I won't be asking that question because you've done a great job answering it. Darrick, let me turn to you. What are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm going to build on what Amy said. I think her and I are in alignment about what we need. I would characterize it as an economic rights frame. I think recognizing that political rights, civil rights are not enough, that if you really want agency. If we want people to have agency in their lives, we should recognize that there are enabling goods and services that without them, you have no agency. And there's a public role to ensure that people are not at the whim of the rationing that comes about from the profit maximizing decision where firms will be incentivized to restrict output or charge higher prices in order to gain profit. The government has a different fiduciary responsibility, and that's to its people. And it should ensure that everyone has those without the stigma of being racialized, as well as the burden in these goods. And I could say a little more about them, but what I should have led with was reparations if we're talking about race. If we're talking about race, when we have reparations, we will have the truth and reconciliation, which will include the full-throated acknowledgement of how we got so unequal today, along with the accountability of redress. So that truth and reconciliation not only provides dignity to the narratives of the way we describe inequality against Black people, but it would redefine poverty more broadly. We racialize the white poor. And Amy was alluding to this when she said we have an anti-Blackness frame of addressing poverty. So white people are otherized also. The term, I'm not the first to say this, the term white trash is intended to distinguish poor whites from the good white people. And those are very racialized. So reparations has that truth and reconciliation that without it, we will never get beyond our race problem in America. But that said, reparations won't be enough. Reparations is a retrospective policy that is intended to, again, address the narratives, as well as provide material redress for all the things you mentioned, Michael. There's a huge head start, but we need something prospective as well, because like I began with, there's a tendency for capital and politics to iterate and concentrate, and without government intervention, they will continue to do what they do best. So an economic rights frame, I don't like the jargons of people calling it socialist or capitalist, because in reality, our public policy never practices either one. Industrial policy is not capitalism. Those are government interventions intended to address market outcomes. That's not capitalism. Indeed, our industrial policy should be more labor-centric than it is, but that's a tangent I'm not going to get into. But I'll say that coupled with reparations would be an economic rights frame where we ensure things like capital. We know that the source of inequality is some young Americans have access to an endowment that puts them in an asset that is going to passively appreciate over their life, like a home, like a business, some capital to start a business, or a debt-free college education to put them in a managerial professional occupation with a 401k plan. So baby bonds is intended to give every American a progressive endowment at birth so that when they become a young adult, they can use it towards some capital enhancement. I think we need a federal job guarantee. And I could say a whole lot more about why and the value of those jobs, because right now, imagine a waitress who's putting up with sexual harassment to feed her family. Well, with a federal job guarantee, she would have a viable alternative without the threat of being destitute. And the jobs would be used to build our public, physical, and human infrastructure. We could literally have a care economy that provides quality care from birth all the way through elder care for all Americans. And we could provide that work with the dignity of wages and benefits that right now it often goes uncompensated. We need banking. So in the 21st century, everybody should have access to a financial account without fees, and we can do it. Frankly, we're born with Social Security. That's a financial account. There's no reason we can't extend it to everyone. Healthcare, I'm supportive of Medicare for all, that when you are sick and you are going to a doctor, that burden of finance should not be upon you. and everybody should have access to care at that point. I mean, in a pandemic, we clearly see that the benefits of Medicare for all. And then education, debt-free, and public colleges and universities should be free as well. And everybody should have the free mobility in society without the threat of bodily harm or detention because your identity is linked to some marginalized group. The last thing I'm going to say is, in thinking about these policies in general, and this was brought up by Regina, you can't divorce people from their larger family context. So there is value to an intersectional analysis of looking at the intersections of gender and race. And of course, we can think about intersectionality not only for Black women, for Black men, and context matters, but we also need to understand, and I'm going to give a shout out to a colleague. She has a new book out called Black Women, Black Love, and it's called America's War on the African-American Marriage, and it's written by Diane Stewart. And in that book, she makes the point that people have a right to love. They have a right to, so even if, and this is not a heteronormative perspective, same-sex couples, everyone has a right to love. And at the root of love is resources, that without resources, you end up in relationships that could be not properly resourced and they could end up dysfunctional. So one of the brilliant things that Diane Stewart does in this book is describe how the deprivation of resources for Black people have led to this evolution where they have not even been adequately offered the opportunity for love as white people.
That's a very personal way to end a list of what I think are great, very specific recommendations. Lisa, do you want to add? That's a hard thing to add to, but do you want to add anything on this part of what do we do essentially?
I'm voting for Darrick. I have my ballot right over here. I was going to walk it down to City Hall tomorrow. But now I know what to do. No, I think everyone has covered a lot of ground from the big to the small level. The only thing I would add, and if I may have actually missed it, was just a radical reform of the criminal justice system. But I agree with reparations, with the whole with this very broad-based systemic overhaul that really needs to be done. And you might want to get a couple of questions from the audience, Michael. So I won't repeat what others have said.
Thanks for giving me time to do that. Fortunately, you've actually answered a number of them as they were coming in through your comments. But there's one that's more specific to Penn or several people have brought this up, which is what's Penn's responsibility? And I'll expand it, Darrick, to higher education more generally. And some of them specifically talk about the pilots issue, but more generally, an open-ended question: what is an Ivy League privileged institution like Penn? What's our responsibility in addressing some of these issues, both within our community, within Philadelphia, and more broadly? If anyone would like to give their thoughts on that, that would be great.
I mean, I think there's a lot that Penn can do. And the first thing I want to do is give a shout out to the School of Social Policy and the Dental School, which created an online course called Penn and Racism that the incoming students in those two schools were required to take this summer. We found out about it kind of late and made it optional for our students, but it really begins to investigate and explore the legacy of racism of Penn in its neighborhood and in its actions, which I think is really valuable. So first, I think there needs to be an acknowledgement and a recognition of what has been done and apologies to the community. I would also say that being a good neighbor, having a lot more investment in the local community, and really thinking about the culture of the place. I think at the sort of local levels of our different departments, many of us are working on things about how to make the curriculum more anti-racist and how to think about admissions differently, et cetera, how to make the whole program more, all of our programs more inclusive. But I also think we need to think about culture and community in a big way. The fact that when people walk on campus, our campus is quite public. People walk through it, that there are, I feel completely welcome and at home, and my Black colleagues do not, and my Black students do not. And so that's clear. I think also Penn does some work in terms of welcoming students from Philadelphia, and has done some work in terms of thinking about making the college more diverse, but it's a very expensive place to go to school. I teach mostly graduate students, and even those that we give full scholarships to have a lot of fees, have medical expenses. We created an emergency fund this year, and we're funding things. I found out one of my students had done all of her homework for the first month on her phone in graduate school, right? So the disparities are incredible, and they're often invisible to us. So I'll stop there. I'm sure the other panelists have things to say.
Anyone else on this issue of what can places like Penn do to this effort?
Yeah. I'd be happy to throw a quick one out. Ditto to everything that Lisa said. I think one big thing is sort of, those of us that are in a position where we're running things need to be willing to let go a little bit, right? And so part of the problem is that we talk about pipelines, and there's a lot of hand wringing over pipelines. How do we diversify our pipelines for scholarship? How do we diversify our pipelines for admissions? But we keep moving the same chess pieces around the same exact chessboard, and we don't address the actual structure of the pipeline itself. So, one of the things, that, like, shout out to Provost Pritchett for really championing this, like with the new center that we're running at SP2, we've built in a mechanism where folks from local HBCUs who partner with us in research have an affiliation at Penn. And that cost us a lot. Like, I would rather keep that money, frankly. That could inflate who I hire. But if I don't choose to do that from the very beginning, and if I don't have a system that's backing me to do that from the very beginning, that's actually pushing resources down and out, we don't have a prayer of sort of rethinking it or reimagining it. And so whatever structure you're building, be it a research study, a center, whatever kind of your footprint is on your campus or within higher ed, is thinking about not just how do I diversify the people that are in the chessboard, but how do I reconfigure the very structure itself so that we are spreading resources down and out, and drawing on that expertise, that's elsewhere. And there's a lot of different ways we could do that. That's just one quick example, because I'm working on it literally this week, so it's top of mind. But that requires us to be willing to let go and say, I'm going to spread these resources around. It doesn't have to all live at Penn. That's
great. That's a great point. As I said, you've answered a lot of the questions from the audience. I just want to mention one more of a comment than a question that came up that is related to this notion of, is it race or class? What's the role of income and wealth? Which is just a reminder that even African Americans who have succeeded, and I don't need to tell the people on this panel this, and who have wealth, it certainly is a huge buffer. It certainly makes life a lot easier, even in a racist society, but it doesn't avoid it. And so I just want to make that point that it is not, while it may be foundational, it's not the only issue that needs to be addressed in American society as it comes to issues of race. But I'm going to end here because I'm mindful of both the panelists and the audience's time. I would like to first of all, thank the panelists tremendously. This exceeded my expectations. It was a great conversation. I realize we've only scratched the surface, but I think we've scratched it well. And I think you all have made some great points. I want to note that our next panel in this series is going to be on November 11th, Wednesday from 5 to 6:15. And we will be sending out information about it, but it's another great panel dealing with issues of the economy, but in this case, at the micro level, workplace, diversity, culture, and leadership in the workplace, and how do you create an inclusive culture in the workplace. And it's the panelists include former provost and professor of law, Anita Allen, Jaya Isola, assistant professor and assistant dean for inclusion in Penn Medicine, Stephanie Creary, an assistant professor of management at the Wharton School at Penn, and very excited that it also includes the new dean of the Wharton School, Erica James, where this is an area of expertise for her. So I invite our audience to sign up when you get that notice, and to spread the information about the panel and other panels widely. I want to say that while I expected my whiteness to be front and center in a gathering like this, it's especially true because of the lighting in my apartment. So I apologize for the lighting that I have. I'm not quite as ghostly as this has made me look. I want to remind everybody to please vote. And I want to say to the people who asked good questions that we weren't able to get to, it's only because of time, not because they weren't great questions, and hopefully they were at least indirectly answered for you. And to say thank you, goodbye, have a great evening. Thank you all.